So it's been a while since we posted the last installment in the life of Disney legend Mary Blair. Let me quickly just catch everyone up with what generally happened in the last few episodes, so then we're ready to push forward today. In 1941, Mary traveled with her husband Lee and other Disney artists to Latin America to develop material for the Goodwill pictures, including Saludos Amigos. The following year, after Lee left to develop training films with the Navy, she returned to Mexico to develop material for the Three Caballeros. After that, she traveled to Cuba, where she worked on material for a third but never produced Goodwill picture, largely focused on the Caribbean. During the war years, Mary lived in California with her friend and animator Retta Scott, the two of them dividing the house she once shared with Lee. Retta also watched the house as Mary visited Lee in Virginia and while she traveled to Georgia to explore concepts for Song of the South. Though at one point Lee had been higher on the list of important concept artists at the Disney studio than Mary, during the war years, as Mary's style evolved, taking in both modern and folk elements, she quickly became one of, if not the most important concept artist at the Disney studio, the only concept artist whose studio work also embraced some elements of modern art movements then being explored in Europe, particularly the move away from linear 1- and 2-point perspectives that offered a believable illusion of depth in a painting. Beyond her work as a concept artist, Walt also looked to her as a color stylist to help define the palette that would be used to define emotion in individual scenes and through the course of a picture. In this, Mary was becoming one of the most valued artists at the studio, humbly rising above those with whom she had worked for a few years. But an elevation in status would also bring its own problems. And this generally is where we left off and also where we start today. By the start of 1945, Mary had a clear sense of her new role at the studio. She was the artist who took Walt's loose ideas and gradually assembled them into a visually coherent presentation with watercolors and drawings, sometimes with pastels, gouache, and other media. Her images at their best communicated the emotional tones of a story. They defined the personality of key characters. They offered a visual path as to how the plot would progress from beginning to end, often with colors changing to indicate shifts in the plot's intensity. And they established a vision as to how a screen presentation using animation would embrace or alter the realistic world where the story was set. In short, Mary's work laid out the visual possibilities for how a film, often adapted from a book or set of stories, would exist as an artistic presentation on screen for scenes composed with both animation and live action. Starting in the mid-1940s, she was typically the first visual artist assigned to a feature film. She was also the only Disney artist whose central job was to leave the studio, work remotely, and either mail back her paintings or return with a set of images that would guide a project forward. Other artists did leave for research, such as Freddie Moore and Frank Thomas, but for them these research trips were a departure from their regular duties. In the mid to late 1940s, the process of field and archival research was the center of Mary's contributions to the Disney studio. In this way, her designs often shaped a project, set up its borders, defined its visual terrain, before character designers, layout artists, and animators contributed to the picture. By this point, Disney owed the Bank of America $4 million, a tremendous sum that it needed to survive during the war. Under the terms of its debt, Disney needed the bank's approval to create features. Due to the risk and also to the troubling returns on recent Disney projects such as Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi, Bank of America wouldn't fund high-cost traditional animated features with linear stories until European markets reopened to American films. On the other hand, the studio's distributor, RKO, was resistant to support fully live-action projects, as they didn't feel Disney yet had the dramatic clout of other studios, such as Warner Brothers. Nor did RKO feel they could successfully distribute and market a Disney film without significant sections of animation. They were so insistent on this point that they clearly specified this requirement in their upcoming contract with Disney that each film shall be an animated cartoon or be part of an animated cartoon and part live action. As a result, Walt was forced to create films that combined live action with animated sequences. In terms of marketing, the animated sections would define the project as a Disney film, but the live-action sections would make these projects financially acceptable to Bank of America. During this period, along with Song of the South, Walt asked Mary to explore two other feature-length projects that would rely heavily on live action. One was a live-action version of Alice in Wonderland, possibly to star dancer Ginger Rogers, who was then in her early 30s. This project would adapt story concepts that had been developed largely by Disney artist David Hall before the war. During previous explorations of Alice, Walt had felt that his concept and story artist weren't allowing the comedy to come from the characters themselves. He also felt that his artist was struggling to update the humor in the original 1865 novel for a modern audience. Mary's charge here was to overcome the problems in the previous Disney treatment, though exactly how she was to do this remained unclear, especially as she was taking concepts that had been designed for animation and arranging them, at least in part, for live-action actors. The other project held more promise, as it had been initially envisioned as a live-action film with animated segments. This project would eventually be called So Dear to My Heart, based on the novel Midnight in Jeremiah by Sterling North, though at this time the project simply reused the book's title, with both Mary and Walt often calling it simply Midnight. Its author, Sterling North, was a man who shared many of Walt's lifelong interests. Not only had North written biographies of Walt's heroes, such as Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Edison, he had also written this novel, which was set just after the turn of the century in the Midwest, in a small farming town that reminded Walt of the place where he had spent his early years. North's novel, Midnight in Jeremiah, was set in Pike County, Indiana, about 350 miles away from Marceline, Missouri, where Walt had grown up. But the culture of these two farming communities was nearly identical. To further tie the film to the book, Disney planned to bring North to the studio so he could take the first pass on the script. People at the studio understood that Walt had connected with this project in a unique way. Layout artist Ken Anderson explained, Walt felt he was a religious person, though he didn't go to church. So Dear to My Heart was his idea of a religious picture. By this, Anderson suggested that for Walt the film's subject approached something nearly sacred. Walt's idea of the sacred might be placed into American culture of the recent past, a time where, at least in his imagination, America strived toward stronger moral values and a deeper sense of community. The 1800s and the early 1900s were a canvas onto which Walt projected strong values of humanity, even if these ideas in his imagination exceeded the scope of actual history. His vision of the recent American past offered a place where the general goodness of small-town life radiated from nearly every character. Examples of this are sprinkled throughout his career, from cartoons like Ben and Me about Ben Franklin to the film Johnny Tremaine about the American Revolution, From the construction of Main Street, USA, to the inspirational Abraham Lincoln figure he would eventually create for the New York World's Fair. Small-town attitudes of bygone eras were the cornerstone of Walt's moral experience, a place of unique human connections and generosity that through film he recreated for his audience, offering a visual and moral example of how life might be lived. Beyond Walt's interest in the recent past, many Americans, after nearly 4 years of war, were looking back before Pearl Harbor and the Depression to a simpler time, when a town's community was the center of a person's social life. In this way, the American audience was primed to engage the type of small-town stories that Walt was now interested in filming. In Song of the South, the animation was largely focused on whimsical fantasy in which mischievous animals acted out life lessons. The human actors and the animated figures eventually interacted, bringing together the two worlds in its finale. In Midnight and Jeremiah, however, the animation would serve a different purpose. Disney producer Bill Anderson explained that the animation here could give the film more nostalgia, more basic appeal. In this, the human actors and the animated figures would never interact. Essentially, the animation would texture the film so that all of its visual presentation seemed to be a fond memory of the recent past, like a daydream enjoyed by the film's lead character. Mary, too, sensed that this project held a special meaning for Walt, one that would not only create the era and the general region of his childhood, but also depict community values that reflected those Walt associated with his youth. As with Song of the South, Mary left her home in Los Angeles, letting Retta Scott care for it while she developed material for Walt's films. She would divide her research between observing Indiana regions where Midnight and Jeremiah was set and archival research in New York, where she would explore material for both Midnight and Alice in Wonderland. Walt once again allowed Mary to use her company travel to visit Lee, who was now in Maryland, a few miles south of Annapolis. By this point, it was clear that Walt was making special allowances for Mary to make sure her work with Disney not only brought her professional satisfaction, but also personal happiness. One could argue that her previous trip to Georgia would take her within a day's travel of where Lee lived and worked, but now with the prime location being Indiana, no one could reasonably believe that a side trip to visit Lee was a short diversion, especially when it appears Mary's trip east both begins and ends with days with Lee. It's possible that Walt added on the New York leg of the trip largely to justify Mary's excursion to see her husband. More than anything, these unique privileges spoke to how deeply Walt valued Mary's work at the studio. And on Mary's end, she made sure to hold up her end of the bargain. While with Lee, she continued with her drawings and watercolors each day to further develop a style for both pictures. Once on the East Coast, she wrote Walt a letter. "My appreciation for the opportunity to work this way is very genuine," she said. She also told him that she was exploring visual motifs that might help center the film based on Midnight and Jeremiah back in 1903. "Well, I'm working on sketches and ideas premised on our last discussion," she said. "I found a good book on American quilts and bought it for the studio. It seems that quilt making is a revived art in this country now, which fact adds more value to use it as a medium of expression in our picture." Some of her early paintings, perhaps done before arriving in Indiana, suggested that the farm community from a distance could be presented as though each farmer's land, with its own crops, was a different patch on a quilt that covered the county. Walt didn't follow up with the suggestion that the county itself might be arranged as a quilt, but many months later he did use quilts as the backdrop for the film's opening credits. Mary's first stop, however, was in New York, where she met with Disney producer Percy Pierce, who would bring with him material from recent story meetings. In all likelihood, Pierce was in New York to meet with members of the Disney office there. "While in New York," Mary wrote, "I will also have the opportunity to go over the latest story developments and plans with Percy. I will also spend some time in the New York Library and Museum to find what they have to offer in the way of research material for both Midnight in Jeremiah and Alice in Wonderland." After New York, she flew with Pierce to Indiana, where, just as she had done in Georgia, she tried to get a feel for the region. Its buildings, its roads, its trees. The original plan was for the Disney film to film in Brown County, Indiana. But after production costs started to rise and after Roy began to kiddingly call the film so dear to my pocketbook, to save money, the production would eventually be shot in California. This ultimately made Mary's work even more valuable. The trees in Indiana would have to be presented by California oaks, but most everything else, from the cabin where the family lived to the train station to the county store, would be built to suit the film, largely from Mary's paintings. While in Indiana, she created illustrations to bring the story to life. In this, she was using the exact skills she had learned from her old teacher, Pruitt Carter. Years ago in Carter's class, she had believed her watercolors would one day bring essays and short stories to life in magazines, with her images published alongside the text. Now, though, she wasn't working with magazines, but the more popular and more visual medium of film. She created images similar to those that might be found in a magazine, only here they would guide film production rather than complement a printed story. The novel Midnight in Jeremiah focused on a young boy who raised a black lamb against the objections of his grandmother. Through his struggles, he learned perseverance, empathy, and the importance of family bonds, essentially the near-religious attitudes that Walt often paired with historical material set in America. For this project, Mary would create art, particularly of the young boy and his grandmother, that would define the period, suggest art direction, and help actors to anchor themselves to this time in history. Mary's watercolors, as she developed them, weren't simply an exploration of space or character. On their surface, they were deeply researched presentations as to how Midwestern farm life existed in the early 1900s, from homemade rocking chairs to horse-drawn carts to early automobiles, from sun-faded lace curtains to the kerosene lamp that Jeremiah carried with him each night to bed. The buildings, as she painted them, were loose suggestions for those who later designed the sets. The general store, for example, as built for the film, was nearly identical to the image in Mary's early paintings. Beyond this, her eye for clothing, particularly for the female characters, would inspire costuming used in the film. Beyond the research details, she considered how color could create a pleasing vision of the Midwest, partially as described by Walt. Gone were the bright tones she had favored in South America. Gone, too, were the reds, browns, and black tones she had used for her Song of the South. Instead, her paintings were filled with springtime greens, chalky blues, and autumnal yellows and oranges, colors that defined the life rhythms of the Midwest as being different than those of earlier projects. And beyond the color selection, many of her paintings through washes appeared faded, as though these images had been stored for years in an attic and were only now being rediscovered. In this way, she was able to lower herself down into the world of a story and through trial and error intuit her way toward images that would represent the underlying mood of a film that didn't even yet have a full script. While in Indiana, imagining the past, she learned of news that would shape her future. On Monday, April 30th, thousands of miles away in Berlin, Hitler committed suicide. 8 days later, the German High Command surrendered to Allied forces. The war in the Pacific continued to rage with multiple battlefronts and the Allies considering a possible D-Day style invasion of Japan. But the end of the European war allowed Mary to consider life after war and offered hope that she and Lee would soon live together again. Her last stop on this trip was again to visit Lee, where she now saw the vague outline of how her future life might look with him. By this point, Lee was a different person than he'd been in California. He now knew that there were other ways to make a career for himself, to keep that Blair family name in front of the public, and to earn a living other than through gallery shows and by working in animation. During his time in the Navy, he had become a producer of both animation and live-action subjects. He felt he had come to know some of the stresses in Walt's life, from budget and production timelines. From talking with ex-studio workers in his unit, he now sensed that there might be a better way to support his family, also to support his art. In this, he was considering other options for himself after the war, perhaps even starting a production firm with 1 or 2 fellow officers. But Lee knew that all of those things needed to wait until after the war in the Pacific was over. By all accounts, both Lee and Mary enjoyed their weeks together. By this point, Lee lived in a comfortable section of town, a small community on a peninsula. We rented a nice house down at Chalk Point in Galesville, just south of Annapolis, he said, right on Chesapeake Bay. During the day, he went into the Navy Center and worked on both training films and films that dissected recent battles to better train officers on strategies that were effective against the Japanese. Mary stayed at the house and created paintings for Disney. She was working on features, Lee said. She'd work long and send the stuff back. In this way, she established the habit of working remotely and then, likely at the end of each week, sending a package of paintings and drawings along with some notes back to Walt. Mary enjoyed herself so much, the solitude of each day for her work, the discussions of how life might arrange itself after the war, and also the possibility of finally starting a family, that she wanted to extend her visit if only by a few days. At the end of May, she wrote studio manager Jack Levin to see if her train ticket, which had a firm date in June, could be extended. Levin, almost surely after discussing this matter with Walt, gave Mary permission to extend her stay and then told her how to extend her return date without any additional expense to the studio. He advised that, a 5 or 10-day extension can be granted at no additional charge provided you have a doctor's certificate which can be for any cause at all. In short, he told Mary that she needed to pretend she had a minor illness that would delay her travel. To this, Mary replied, a sore throat or a toothache could be easily arranged. It's nice in California, but I'm enjoying this stay with Lee so much. However, I will see you in July and will be glad, for I do miss my friends. Not long after she returned to Burbank, Walt put that Alice project on hold yet again. Later in the year, Walt thought that perhaps British writer Aldous Huxley, best known for his novel Brave New World, might find a way to make a live-action version of Alice, perhaps focusing on the actual girl who had been the inspiration for the Alice stories. But work on Midnight and Jeremiah, or what would soon be called So Dear to My Heart, was beginning to take shape, in part based on the strengths of Mary's paintings. With So Dear to My Heart moving forward, Walt talked to Mary about other projects. Now that the war was over in Europe at least, he explored the possibility of Mary traveling to Ireland to develop a story about Irish folklore, including leprechauns, either as an animated feature or as a feature that again mixed animation with live action. The project at this time was called The Little People, but Walt didn't yet have a firm grasp of the story, other than the plot would incorporate multiple Irish tales about the fairy folk. Instead, he offered Mary a gift of sorts. He wanted her to explore a visual subject that was reasonably close to her own personal style. All of this would be converted eventually into traditional rounded Disney animation, but the initial work at least would hold the flatness that defined much of Mary's own work. The project, called Once Upon a Wintertime, would be a cartoon eventually folded into a future package feature that drew upon the work of Currier and Ives. As Storyman Art Scott recalled, one day Walt told him, "I want to do something with Currier and Ives' theme." He had already recorded the music for the short. Now he needed someone, meaning Scott, to develop a story that would lightly link together some of the more memorable motifs from Currier and Ives' Christmas-time images. "Maybe you can work it out," Walt said as he walked away. Like most Americans in the mid-1940s, Scott was aware of the images produced by Currier and Ives. Currier and Ives had initially found success in the mid-1800s, selling low-cost prints of American life, but they were particularly known for their scenes of winter: people ice skating, families sledding, and couples walking in the snow. Images that gained popularity by being featured on Christmas cards. Scott used these cards as a starting point to imagine a light narrative motif to create a warm, humorous story focused on young love. The story, as he pictured it, involved a young man and young woman named Joe and Jenny out on a sleigh ride who stop at a frozen pond where they skate across the ice. But after the lovers quarrel, Jenny skates off to a place where the ice is beginning to break, leaving Joe along with some animals to rescue her. With another storyman, Alberto Beccattini, Scott also made some sketches to illustrate his ideas. Then he handed his work over to Mary to illustrate his story concepts with far more detailed and appealing designs and colors. The figures in a Currier and Ives print have a graphic flatness to them, like detailed cutouts put on top of a background, which was not unlike Mary's watercolors. Mary likely found it easy to adapt her concept drawings into a style similar to that of Currier and Ives, with the usual expectation that the animation department would round out her work and add depth. For this project, some of her images were done in pastels, others in gouache, yet others in tempera. The plan initially was to bring these Christmas cards to life much in the style of other Disney cartoons. But after she finished her images, something unexpected happened. By this point, Mary had a handful of admirers at the studio, one of them being Ken O'Connor, whose job it was to lay out Mary's work into a series of drawings that would guide both animators and background painters as they developed the cartoon. O'Connor initially was going to lay out this as he had other cartoons, but as he loved Mary's artwork and as Walt was presently away from the studio, he believed he could design a cartoon that would bring Mary's paintings to life with her character designs and her sense of background imagery. "She did some beautiful preliminary inspirational paintings," O'Connor explained. "I took that up. I started to clean up the layouts in the old-fashioned way. Then I said, damn, this is no good compared to the way Mary had styled it. I told my assistant, Don Griffith, we're going to re-clean this up the way Mary started her painting in a contemporary manner." He studied her work again, trying to figure out how to arrange her designs for animation. "I'm going to throw out every damn thing we've done," he told his assistant. "Let's do this the way we should have done it." Together, O'Connor and Griffith created the layouts, designing them as might Mary. They put aside familiar concepts of 1- and 2-point perspective and drew them in Mary's style. "I tried to hang on to her stuff," O'Connor said, And I did things to make them look the way she did in scenes of the sleigh being pulled down in the afternoon, the evening, with the girl and boy in it. Once they had a draft of all the layout drawings, they asked Mary to help finalize them. Mary cleaned them up after that, Art Scott confirmed. From there, with Walt still away, O'Connor convinced the rest of the production team to follow through with this attempt to make a Mary Blair-style cartoon. I talked to the director, Hamilton Lusk, O'Connor said. O'Connor took him aside, then added, "Well, how about getting the animators to start making the people that are skating go in a decorative manner instead of really realistic?" He waited for Lusk to respond, but Lusk was hesitant. "In a decorative way," Scott added, "in a designy way." Lusk finally agreed. The lead animator, Eric Larson, was more resistant than Lusk, likely believing their actions might anger Walt once he returned. Eventually, though, Larson agreed to animate or attempt to animate reasonably flat Mary Blair-style figures placed into the snowy world of Currier and Ives. One of the challenges with flat characters was how to rotate their form in a believable way, especially up close. So in Larson's animation, figures often remained in profile, three-quarter view, or straight on for far longer periods of time than in other Disney cartoons. When they did rotate, they tended to shift quickly, which partially masked their lack of roundness. Or the turn itself was reasonably far from the camera, which also masked their lack of depth. This was generally how he tried to incorporate figures designed in a 2D medium for a medium that offered an illusion of depth and roundness. As he animated, he discussed his unique choices and progress with Mary. "I did work closely with Mary Blair on it," he said. Not everyone in the animation department was a fan of this experiment. Ollie Johnston, for example, felt you couldn't duplicate Mary's drawings in animation. There was no way. He admired Mary's work as a static painting, but he believed that her character designs, when set in motion, would appear stiff and limit the level of emotion they could convey. Her paintings were, well, more of a decorative thing, he said. It was inspirational art rather than art designed to guide animation. Likewise, animator Mark Davis, also a fan of Mary's work, could see the underlying problems with translating her character designs into Disney-style animation. Mary's things were more left and right or up and down, he said. They didn't have the endless railroad perspective, meaning that they lacked the depth one sees when looking at twin rails that appeared to move closer as they stretched off into the distance. Still, the project moved forward. From there, Ken O'Connor went over to the background department to make sure their paintings would follow the unique style he had placed into the layouts. "Well, I found a sympathetic background painter in Art Riley," O'Connor said. With that, he had all of the key individuals working in a way that would depart from the rounded style of most Disney animation. "We carried out the flat contemporary design like Mary started it," O'Connor said. "Why was I so brave? Walt was in Europe." In this, O'Connor took a calculated risk. He knew that for the most part, Walt's taste in art was conservative, but he liked Mary's modern approach to watercolors, something that was a significant departure, for example, from the way that her husband painted. Mary's watercolors were often arranged with a non-traditional perspective, similar to avant-garde artists in Europe, but her underlying conceit, that is, the emotions that her work conveyed, were closer to a traditional narrative warmth embraced by Walt. She was both modern in the design and traditional in the underlying theme, which likely is what Walt valued in her work. When Walt came back, O'Connor watched to see if he was angered by their design choices, especially as it was now too late to change the film's style Unless, of course, Walt wanted them to start entirely over. "Well, I wasn't trying to fool him," O'Connor said. "I was trying to give him something good, and he never criticized what he saw. I guess it succeeded. I was accused of animating a Christmas card, and it was sort of like that, I admit." The full process to finish Once Upon a Wintertime would take many months and extend into years, but the end result was experimental animation that remained extremely close to Mary's vision for the entirety of the cartoon. Before this, Mary had seen her style replicated in the short Bahia section of The Three Caballeros. But now, an entire Disney cartoon brought not only the spirit of her art, but its graphic style to the screen. With this, Mary's status was elevated again at the studio, as there was now an entire Disney cartoon in production that was wholly guided by her personal style, something that at this point had been granted to no other artist. To add to her stature, Disney also licensed Mary Blair concept art, all of it from the Latin American pictures, to Hallmark, who used her work for greeting cards. Many of the cards featured Mary Blair children, including 4 that were from the Las Posadas sequence in The Three Caballeros. Many of them were Christmas cards, but there was also birthday cards and a Thinking of You card with an image that Mary had painted at Lake Titicaca. They sold individually for 5 cents or could be purchased in a box of 12 for 50 cents. The set featured only the work of Mary, which again suggested she was a key, if not the key, concept artist at the studio, which solidified her lead status among her co-workers. Due to her quiet, soft-spoken nature, most studio artists were supportive of her accomplishments. But there would be some quiet fallout related to her rise at the studio, mostly related to Lee. But that wouldn't happen until later in the year. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan, at least right now, is to continue our story of Mary Blair as she faces some problems at home and also begins to work on key Disney features such as Cinderella. Also, if you'd like to watch the cartoon Once Upon a Wintertime, you can find it on Disney Plus in the package feature Melody Time. It's the first cartoon included in that film. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.